Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 7th webinar of the 2022-2023 EMOS webinars program. My name is Caterina Giusti. I'm professor of statistics at the University of Pisa in Italy. As a member of the EMOS team of my university, I'm working in the organization of this webinar program on behalf of Eurostat, together with the German company Startup. Today, I will act as the webinar moderator. Now, let me first explain for any newcomers that EMOS stands for the European Master in Official Statistics, a joint project of universities and data producers in the EU member states, EFTA, and EU candidate countries. If your university is interested in applying for the EMOS label, please consider that the permanently open call for universities is available on the EMOS dedicated page on Eurostat website. For staying in contact with the EMOS news and community, please follow the EMOS Twitter. The Twitter handle is @EU_EMOS. It's now time to start with our webinar. Before I give the floor to our speaker, let me first briefly explain how we run the webinar today. As you can see this here, the EMOS webinar stream on Zoom. The webinar is recorded and the recording will be uploaded on the EMOS YouTube channel, where you can already find the recording of the past webinars, as well as the past 2 EMOS workshops. As a participant, you can watch and listen to the webinar. You can also use the Q&A manager to pose your question to the presenter during the webinar. Our speaker indeed will be answering questions during all the webinar, so there is no need to wait for a specific question break. Should you have any technical problem or question, please send a message in the chat and you will be contacted by one of the members of the technical staff. Today, we have the pleasure to host Dr. Bálint Menyhért. Bálint is an empirical economist interested in applied micro and macroeconomics, double markets, social policy analysis, and the economic history of Central and Eastern Europe. He currently works as a researcher economist at the European Commission's Joint Research Center in Ispra, Italy. Bálint holds a PhD from the Central European University, has previous work experience from the OECD, the Hungarian Financial Supervisory Authority, and the Federal Reserve Banks of Boston and New York. His main activity currently focuses on socioeconomic resilience, poverty measurement, and the social effect of rising inflation. The project on absolute poverty that he coordinated produces the first set of cross-country comparable absolute poverty lines across the European Union. And today, Bálint indeed will be present about this project, so measuring and monitoring absolute poverty in Europe. So Bálint, the floor now is yours.
Thank you so much, Caterina, for the invitation and this kind introduction. Thank you also to the participants for showing up and showing interest in this work. I hope you hear and see me well. And as Caterina said, indeed, today I will be presenting an absolute poverty measurement initiative that I coordinated at the Joint Research Center, the Science and Knowledge Service of the European Commission. I assume that absolute poverty measurement is not a very popular topic, but it's nevertheless a very rewarding topic in my view, as it is fairly complex and it mixes a great deal of different kinds of data. It also uses different statistical methods. It can allow us to discover thought-provoking new insights about poverty. And last but not least, you will see that it raises a series of policy relevant and important research questions, potentially for your own future work. I will present a particular project, but I'm quite convinced that the way I will present it and the type of questions that it raises are of general interest. You will see that any sort of consistent and cross-country comparable effort aimed at absolute poverty measurement in the European context, for example, will in one way or another deal with the questions that I will be talking about. Before really getting to the heart of the matter, I also have to say that, of course, what I'm saying today doesn't reflect the official position of the European Commission, but rather my own view as an expert. So at this point, I'd like to share my screen with you. I hope that you now can see my cover slide. Please, Katerina, nod if everything is in order.
We can see the slides.
Great. So let's start. Let's start with a little brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I will start with very briefly summing up the European policy context in which this project was initiated, and I will briefly present the project itself. Then I will devote a considerable chunk of this presentation to discussing methodological aspects of absolute poverty measurement, concepts, data, strategies, procedures, methodologies. Later on, I will present and hopefully in an interactive manner discuss with you the result of absolute poverty measurement and the new absolute poverty estimates. Later on, if we have time, then we will be able to discuss a little bit the context, the robustness of these estimates, and some forward-looking considerations that may be important to improve measurement and data availability in the future. And then I will conclude. I encourage you to ask questions at any point during my presentation. We have the questions and answer pop-up window. Feel free to post your questions there, and I should be able to quickly address them on the fly. So let's get going. So a few words about the policy context in which this project was initiated and which context is still valid today. So I would start by saying that social monitoring in the EU uses different sets of portfolios. I've listed a few, for example, the social protection performance monitor, the joint assessment framework, the social scoreboard. These portfolios contain a large number of indicators and are used to assess the social situation and various aspects of the social situation. And typically these portfolios have particular aims. These aims can be to monitor change in the social situation over time in the EU. Another aim could be to identify country-specific challenges, or to measure progress towards the principles of the European Pillar of Social Rights, for example. But once one turns to poverty measurement and the headline sort of social policy objectives that guide long-term planning in the social domain and social policies, one is left with one singular measure or one singular set of measures. These are called the AROPI measures. AROPI is an acronym that stands for At Risk of Poverty and Social Exclusion. And essentially, it is a composite indicator that features both relative and absolute components. It has three main components. The first one is called At Risk of Poverty, which is a relative monetary measure based on 60% of the equivalized national median income. And it measures sort of social exclusion or the degree of social exclusion by identifying those segments of the population whose income level is well below that of the prevailing income in a given member state. The second component is called severe material and social deprivation. It's an absolute and non-monetary composite indicator of enforced inability. It has 13 dimensions and tries to identify whether individuals and households are able to satisfy their basic needs, have a healthy diet, whether they can afford to keep their homes warm, and other questions. And if households answer that in at least half of these domains they have difficulties, they feel deprived, then they are considered severely and materially and socially deprived. The third component is low work intensity, which is an indicator of social exclusion through the labor market. It identifies households that work less than 20% of their work time total. And putting all this together, we get a fairly comprehensive, rich measure of poverty and social exclusion. But of course, additional perspectives, additional methods, additional approaches can yield new insights, and especially if these approaches allow for, say, direct comparability at not only at national levels, but also subnational levels, say local and regional level, or supranational level, direct EU-wide comparisons. New approaches have a good chance of making policy relevant contributions if they are able to combine the monetary character of AROP with the needs-based absolute perspective of severe material and social deprivation, for example. Also, if they can support efforts to operationalize thematic social policy and poverty concepts like that of energy poverty, transport poverty, housing affordability, concepts which become and have become more and more important over the last few years, and especially in the context of the current inflationary situation. And last but not least, a measure that is sensitive and responsive to inflation and adjustment in the cost of living would also be very policy relevant. So this is more or less the context in which we got this mandate to launch this project. It's a joint cooperation between the Director General of Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, one DG of the European Commission, and the JRC. The project lasted for 3 years. Our objectives were to design, develop, and pilot an absolute poverty measure that is suitable for EU-wide measurement, and to also create implementation guidelines for future EU-wide use, EU-level scale-up, and regular measurement. Not only did we have to come up with a method and actually implement that method, but also consider the long-term usability and applicability of the proposed method. We were relying on a small project core team that included Zsombor Cseres Gergely, Virmantas Kvedaras, Benedetta Mina, Filippo Pericoli, and Slavica Zek of the JRC. But of course, we were not alone. A large number of institutional stakeholders and expert participants have helped us along the way. We could rely on internal commission functions to sort of communicate with partner DGs and reflect views and needs of these various commission functions in our work. We had an advisory board that consisted of reputable experts, academics, but also practitioners, even anti-poverty advocacy group members, among others. We had national expert teams working for us that provided expertise with reference budget construction. And we also had external consultants and data providers to give us thematic specific help with data and various modeling aspects. And of course, given the sort of data intensive nature of absolute poverty measurement, we were very much in connection and in cooperation with national and European statistical authorities. So the result of all this work is summed up in the APSPO final report that we published in December 2021. It's a large 250-page document that can be read in both ways, both as either as a policy document, if one focuses on the initial and later chapters, but also as a technical methodological guidebook for absolute poverty measurement if one zooms in on the middle chapters that detail the actual methodology and various measurement strategies that we undertook. The full report is available in the JRC Publications repository. I recommend that you take a look, download it, and see what it contains. But my hope is that it will also be available as a methodological handbook by a large international publisher very soon. So after this much introduction, I would start with getting to the details. First taking a look at the sort of conceptual background of absolute poverty measurement as we implemented it. So first, I think it makes sense to make the distinction between absolute and relative poverty measurement. What does absolute mean in this context? It certainly doesn't mean extreme poverty. So absolute doesn't have anything to do with the generosity or the adequacy of the poverty threshold. It rather means that the poverty thresholds are formulated in relation to individuals and households' needs. These can be basic needs, but these can be also more elaborate or generous set of needs. But the important point is that defining these needs and calculating these poverty thresholds is largely independent of the composition of individuals and households in a given community. It's in relation to the individual and specific households that the poverty thresholds and adequacy of financial resources are postulated. The alternative approach is the relative measurement, which focuses very much on context-specific social standards, focuses on the prevailing standards in a given society, and tries to identify those individuals and households that fall behind relative to this standard. So these two approaches are quite different, and they have also implications to the specific uses of these poverty thresholds over time. While relative poverty thresholds tend to signal change in social exclusion over time, absolute poverty thresholds are meant to represent a fixed standard against which progress can be evaluated. So if you think of the global poverty line used by the World Bank, you may have heard about it, the $1, now more recently $2 per day poverty threshold. That's very much an absolute threshold. And that allowed us to review how global poverty has been changing over time. Now, for the purposes of this project, we had to make some research and see what we can rely on in calculating cross-country comparable absolute poverty thresholds. And we didn't find much. We found that absolute monetary poverty thresholds are rarely used in the EU, as opposed to developing countries where they are more popular. But we could rely on previous Commission-funded projects that produce international or cross-country comparable reference budgets. We could rely on methodologies developed by the Italian Statistical Office, as Italy is the only country in the EU as of today that carries out absolute poverty measurement on a regular basis. And we could also rely on various statistical techniques used in developing countries, typically, to map from food minimum needs to overall minimum needs and calculate absolute poverty thresholds that way. But as you may already see, none of these tools or sources are readily applicable in our current context, where the focus is EU-wide measurement aimed at comparable poverty thresholds across countries. So to kind of solve this puzzle or riddle and ensure, on the one hand, that poverty thresholds are internationally comparable, but also locally valid, we came up with this idea of using different layers of modeling to calculate poverty thresholds. We used an EU-wide component as far as concepts are concerned. So we define adequate social participation as the common EU-wide target that we aim at. We have a national component, and these concern individuals and households' minimum needs. These are defined at the national level, in line with the broader EU-wide components, but very much adapted to the particular national context. And then we also have a local component, mainly to reflect geographical differences in living costs and retail prices within countries. So just to give an example, maybe a common EU-wide component could be to allow households some budget for social participation that is commonly reflected in our poverty thresholds, but whereas this may mean a daily coffee at the bar in Italy or a weekly drink at the pub in Ireland, this we sort of differentiate. So in terms of the particular needs and of goods and services, we make a country-by-country differentiation and then calculate the prices at the subnational level. Now you will see in the following slides that very often this chain is not reflected this clearly in our calculations, but at least this is the concept that we follow. I will present different modeling and measurement strategies to arrive at poverty thresholds, but these strategies, for the sake of comparability, will have common elements and procedures. These extend to measurement focus. For example, we focus on income-based and not expenditure-based measurement, and we focus on out-of-pocket expenditures, rather than, for example, the social cost of securing access to various goods and services for the general population. The measurement structure will be very much the same across different approaches. For example, the expenditure categories that we model. Also, similarities cover measurement tools. We will use reference budget and statistical methods for all our approaches. Technical definitions, for example, welfare aggregates, what concerns individuals and households, resources, and this definition we will fix for all approaches. Likewise for equivalent scales, which allow us to compare households of different size and composition for specifying their needs. And it also extends to individuals and household profiles that we are using. For example, the age and gender types and household types that we cover. So let's now take a look at these measurement strategies that I have been alluding to. We differentiate three of them. We call them reference budget-based approach, survey-based approach, and food-based statistical approach. You see them in the rows of this illustration. Why did we have these many approaches? Well, because at the outset, we were not sure which is the best approach that can function. We haven't really, or none of these approaches have really been tested. And I think, and we thought at the time that it would be, the best approach would be to try out different measurement strategies, see how they relate to one another, see what their implementation costs and resource needs are, and assess what kind of poverty metrics they deliver. If you look at the columns, you will also see the expenditure categories across. We model individuals and households' minimum needs. These are food, housing, transportation, health, and residual categories. And you also see that all of the measurement approaches cover the same sort of minimum expenditures. They do it by a mixture of reference budgets and survey-based statistical modeling. You see these differently colored boxes. You also see that very much absolute poverty measurement is very much modular. You can use the same component with different approaches. You can even use different components with the same approach. You can see we are working with different food budgets. So depending on one's constraints, needs, particular objectives, one could choose different methods. Of course, what you see here, these three approaches do not cover the entire space of potential approaches. One could go for an entirely exclusively reference budget-based approach or use simply survey-based statistical approaches. But I will argue that that some kind of combination of these two methods is probably the best to deliver reliable and dependable results. Since the implementation costs and resource needs of these different approaches are different, as part of this project, we also differentiated in terms of country coverage. The more resource-intensive reference budget-based approach we only implemented for a small number of pilot countries. These are Finland, Belgium, and Hungary, that represent different set of member states in many regards. But for the more statistical survey-based approaches, we ensured the full coverage of the EU as part of this project. Now let's move on and take a look at the modeling procedure and the data sort of architecture that we relied on. For all approaches, we essentially relied on the same 4 types of data sources, some kind of reference baskets, at least for the food component. I will explain in a minute what reference baskets mean, but in more detail, but essentially they mean illustrative priced baskets of goods and services that characterize a particular realization of satisfying one's basic needs. We need these. As I told you, these can be constructed in different ways, and once we get to the different approaches in detail, you will see what these methods will be. We also needed price information to price these reference baskets, to assign a monetary value to these reference baskets and express their value in monetary terms. Here one has the choice of using a large number of different methods, from local price collections to national price statistics, to household scanner data, to harmonized national price averages produced by Eurostat. Each of these sources have some advantages, some disadvantages. So it is very unlikely that one can find the perfect data source that answers, that fits seamlessly to what one is trying to measure here. But different sources have different advantages and different sort of resource costs, and one has to balance these appropriately. Once we have the reference budgets, the first 2 components, we can turn to the modeling survey. We can turn to the survey information that we used. These are based mainly on the EU HBS. The EU HBS is the harmonized household budget survey of EU countries. Budget surveys are one of the main types of household surveys. They contain households. They give a detailed account of households' expenditures in a very granular fashion and in a representative manner. And one essentially uses these data to pick a reference household whose actual reported expenditure or consumption can be reasonably assumed to function as a minimum threshold. Once we have the survey data, we can calculate the poverty thresholds, either for specific expenditure categories, as you saw it on the previous slide, or for the overall poverty threshold. And then the last sort of task is to actually make the poverty assignment, decide which are the households in the sample that are poor and which are those that are non-poor. And for this measurement, we used EU Silk. The EU Silk is probably the most important EU-level household survey that we use for poverty measurement and various other analysis of the social domain. It stands for Statistics on Income and Living Conditions, and as its name suggests, it contains detailed information on households' income and their living conditions. You may note that the information content on household expenditures, the HBS, the third column, and the information content on income and living conditions, the fourth column, represent two different surveys. So we don't have integrated information at the micro level on households' wealth, households' expenditure, households' income and living conditions. So this is a challenge in many applications nowadays, how to integrate these surveys and how to try to exploit at the micro level these different information components. More generally, we can say that while here on this illustration, on this chart, these different data sources fit seamlessly together, in reality, this is far from the case. You have to be very aware of what you want to do, what kind of measure you want to derive, at what level of granularity, at what level of differentiation, what are the variables by which you want to differentiate your measures. For example, there's no point calculating or creating reference baskets or price information at NUTS3 regional level if the modeling survey only allows for NUTS1 level differentiation. So while one can make these data sets work together in unison, it's a lot of work and a lot of technical and methodological choices to make sure that the fit is as good as it gets. And just to go back to measurement, we used EU-SILC for actual poverty measurement. Why? Because the existing AROPI indicators are also calculated for the EU-SILC, and we can directly take the poverty thresholds that we derived from the modeling surveys and apply it to the particular household types in the EU-SILC, make the assignment, decide whether they are poor or not, and then calculate poverty metrics like the headcount ratio, poverty rate, or compare absolute poverty with relative poverty metrics that are equally calculated with EU-SILC. So moving on, I will now go one by one, hopefully not too slowly, through the three measurement approaches that I have highlighted, and we'll try to tell you about the related challenges, advantages, and potential difficulties. Let's start with the reference budget-based approach. The idea here is to explore how reference budgets that are more readily available in various contexts for many EU countries, how reference budgets can be used for poverty measurement. As I told you, we could build on existing reference budgets produced by colleagues from the Herman Delek Center for Social Policy at the University of Antwerp as part of previous commission-funded initiatives. But there was a great challenge. Most reference budgets are illustrative. They have a particular household type, a particular location, a particular setting in mind. In this case, the existing reference budgets refer to households living in European capitals and consisting of working age adults and children. But of course, that is not enough for poverty measurement. For comprehensive measurement, we want to have appropriate reference budgets for all types of households, not only those living in cities, but also those living in rural areas, not only working age adults, but also maybe the elderly, not only teenage children, but also maybe young children. So a great challenge is how can one ensure to extend this framework to previously non-covered individuals and households and assign a valid and reliable and consistent monetary value for them based on illustrative sets of goods and services. Because existing reference budgets were available exclusively for food and residual budgets, we stuck to that. I will also later tell you why that is seems to be a good choice. And then started with validating and updating those previous reference baskets that were produced. Then we decided to extend the demographic coverage of reference budgets along the lines that I have just told you. So we introduced new individual types, took the existing reference budget baskets and modified them to suit the needs of other individual types like the elderly or small children. But we also needed to consider household level needs, as some of the needs are household level, in a modular way, not only to know what the needs of, say, 2 adults, 2 children households are, but we had to be able to tell what the needs of a 2 adults, 3 children households are, or a 3 adults, 4 children household are. And for this, we needed to understand how needs extend with additional household members. And then we also had to extend geographically these reference budgets to cover non-capital areas. And we did that by keeping the needs and the baskets the same, but undertaking small-scale price collections in various geographical areas in these pilot countries that we covered, Belgium, Finland, and Hungary. On the right-hand side, you see on these illustrations some glimpse of what various reference baskets, what sort of items they contain. You can see that these reference baskets are rather complex. Oftentimes, you not only need to identify the need, but also come up with a relevant product, then maybe a product variant that you can actually look up the price of, and then put this all together. So it's a highly complex, resource-intensive procedure. In the illustration in the corner, down in the lower right corner, you see that it involves a lot of back and forth between different participants and different sort of information sources. Luckily, we could rely on the same national expert teams and coordination methods that were used for the initial construction of these reference baskets, but it was still a very complex undertaking. Now, of course, the advantage of using reference baskets and budgets is that you can have a fairly high degree of control over what you want to have in your sort of poverty measurement, what you consider as essential items associated with a particular standard of living. But I think it's also the disadvantage of this method, that in absence of very strict methodic or systematic rules, there's very little that ensures that, for example, different reference baskets are comparable across countries or comparable across different types. It's very difficult to make educated and consistent choices of what should be included in these baskets. So this is essentially the first generic approach to use reference baskets, price them, and use these resulting budgets or minimum expenditure thresholds as the poverty threshold. Let's look at now a slightly simpler approach. We call it a survey-based approach to APSCO modeling, where the idea is to use statistical modeling of minimum thresholds for non-food expenditures, relying on household survey data. So instead of building the poverty thresholds or expenditure thresholds up from the very bottom through individual items, the idea is to sort of target directly the expenditure threshold, the end process of reference budget construction, and try to identify those households whose expenditure in the household budget survey data can reasonably identified as a good minimum threshold. This is the approach that is closest to the existing approach by the Italian Statistical Office, but of course we couldn't rely on national level data. We had to, for the sake of consistency, we had to rely on European surveys, and the information content of these is very different. As I told you previously, we don't have integrated household data at hand. So household budget survey data only contains expenditures, and other surveys like the EU Silk or other Eurobarometer surveys contain household living conditions. So how do you solve, how do you identify an appropriate threshold in the budget survey data that qualifies as the minimum threshold? Our strategy was the following. We first calculated expenditure-specific deprivation incidence using households' subjective, sometimes objective responses to thematic questions from the living conditions survey, the SIL. For example, in case of housing, we used the overcrowding rate and the housing deprivation indicators to identify in each country, but more specifically in each region and some cases household types, the share of population that suffer from deprivation, that live in dwellings which we can reasonably consider as deficient. In the lower left panel, you see, for example, at the country level, the national share of those households that live in deficient dwellings. It's up to 60% in Romania using 2015 data, and about 20%, say, in Finland at the two ends of the spectrum. So what we then did, we went to the household budget survey with these percentiles and calculated these percentiles of the observed household level expenditure distribution as the relevant threshold. What is our consideration? Well, our consideration was that those households that are deprived or that live in, for example, in case of housing deficient dwellings, probably these are the households that spend less on housing. If we assume that housing quality and household expenditures are correlated. And those households that are non-deprived, they spend more. So there should be a threshold that cuts the observed expenditure distribution in two parts, those deprived and those non-deprived, and that's what we used. Now, of course, in practice, this doesn't function so easily. There are some households that report deprivation, yet spend more than the thresholds. Also, there are households that do not report deprivation, that live, for example, in good quality dwellings, yet spend less on housing than this threshold. But luckily, we had access to data from Hungary, where the HBS and Silk information content are collected on the same sample. So we had both at the micro level and could actually check how well does this approach do, how good a separation that it entails. And we could see, and this is what you can see on the panel in the lower right corner, that the actual separation that we came up with is as good as it gets. There are some households that live in inadequate dwelling that spend more, some households that live in adequate dwellings that spend less than this threshold. But on the whole, the threshold that we came up with is very close to the sort of one that gives us the best separation. What is the advantage of this method? The advantage of this method is that one can easily replicate it for as many countries as are available in these surveys. And one can even cover expenditure categories which are characterized by a large degree of heterogeneity, like transportation, like health. You know, it would be very difficult to come up with a reference basket of medication for most households, as the needs are so diverse. This approach solves this, circumvents this need to start from the bottom and focuses directly at the threshold. Of course, there is heterogeneity across households, so these thresholds will not fit for everyone, but that is a generic problem with absolute poverty measurement. I see that a question has arrived. Could you please clarify, how do you combine the surveys? Do you use only silk in this approach? It's a good question. So what we do, we collect these surveys at the cell level. We define these cells based on geography, some kind of household, in some cases household composition, in some cases age and gender, based on observable features of households that are available in both surveys. In this particular case of survey-based modeling, what we did, we created these cells, different types of cells for each expenditure category, and then calculated these deprivation likelihood or incidence that I previously told you about at the cell level. Now, for each cell, we took this number, and for each cell, we looked at the distribution of household expenditure in the HBS for the same cell, and then derived the appropriate expenditure threshold there. I hope that this brief explanation was clear. Now, moving on to this third approach, we call it food-based statistical approach. In some ways, this is the simplest statistical approach that one can do, because it only relies on food budgets and then extrapolates from food budgets directly to overall poverty thresholds. This is more or less the approach that is used in developing countries, very often by the World Bank, to arrive at some overall poverty threshold in developing countries. Now, why are food budgets good for this purpose? Because it's fairly clear what sort of nutritional dietary needs one has, and it's fairly easy to obtain prices for those. So food budgets are a good basis to start with, and then typically one uses household budget survey data and exploit the structure of expenditures, food versus non-food expenditures, in a simplistic way to get from the food budgets to the overall poverty threshold. How is it done? Typically, one looks for those households in the sample whose food expenditure or overall expenditure corresponds to the actual food reference budget, and then see what these households spend on other items. How did we implement this strategy in the EU context? Well, we needed high quality food reference budgets. And we have discovered that the existing reference budgets that we used in the reference budget-based approach were not such. They were not very consistent. They very often shown great heterogeneity across different individual types, but also across countries. And generally, they yielded very unreliable overall poverty thresholds. So what we did, we reached out to experts at the University of Kiel, who helped us to produce new sets of cross-country comparable nutrition-based food baskets. These baskets are based on common European dietary reference values that give you the exact needs by various individual age and gender types of calories, minerals, fat, and other sort of dietary aspects. And we use these to match national consumption habits through various optimization methods. So the idea is to use these dietary reference values as constraints for an optimization problem that tries to produce food reference baskets that mimic the observed consumption patterns that we see in the HBS data for households. As you can see, this is a very different method from the sort of very elaborate and discussion-intensive way of producing reference baskets. Highly scientific or technocratic way, one could say, but for our purposes, this works very well. You can see the monetized food reference budgets for various single individuals by country in the lower left panel, and you can see how similar they are in terms of structure within countries, and how variable they can be across countries. For example, the budget in Denmark is almost 3 times as high as in Poland, but that is mainly because of differences in food prices. And then once we had these food budgets, we developed a new method to model overall poverty lines based on the food inputs. Why did we need to develop new methods? Mainly because the methods that are used in developing countries are functioning well only in cases where the food expenditure share of households is very high, because the non-food part that you can arrive at is constrained from the above by the starting food budgets, and the food expenditure share in most EU countries, actually in all EU countries, is much lower than the non-food expenditure share. You can see the main food expenditure shares on the lower right panel, these yellow markers, and the right axis will help you identify what share of their expenditures households spend on food. You can see it's inversely related to the overall level of household expenditures. And essentially, what this method gives us, it finds those households whose non-food expenditures are associated with a level of food expenditure that corresponds to these food reference budgets that I have just described. It's a slightly technical approach, a bit difficult to explain you in a few minutes, but the general idea is that we essentially scale up these food budgets by the inverse of the food expenditure share. So if you see that in Romania, the food expenditure share is around 0.33, in Romania, the overall poverty line will be more or less 3 times the food reference budget. And in Luxembourg, the food expenditure share is 10%. So the overall poverty line will be something like almost 10 times, a little bit lower than that, 10 times the initial food budget. And at this point, I stop with describing the methodologies and will invite you to discuss the main APSPO findings, focusing on poverty thresholds and headcount ratio, basically the basic indicators of poverty. There are, of course, other measures in place, for example, the poverty gap, or you may be familiar with the SEN, Shorrock's tone measure that combines poverty depth and poverty incidence and even inequality. But I think our strategy here is to focus on the most basic poverty measures and highlight the difference between the new APSPO measures and the existing poverty indicators. And the questions that I would like to answer are the following: which measurement approach yields the highest, lowest poverty threshold of the 3 that I have?
Bálint, should I launch the poll in the meanwhile?
Yes, okay, in a second.
Thank you.
What is the relationship between absolute and relative poverty in the country? What is the distribution of absolute and relative poverty across the EU? And how cyclical or how do absolute and relative poverty behave over time. And to get you involved a bit more in this, we have prepared a little poll for you. You should be able to see that already in a pop-up window on your screen. And I would invite all of you to consider these questions and maybe spend the next 1 or 2 minutes in guessing which of these answers, according to you, are the most appropriate. And then in a minute's time, we take a look and then discuss a little bit further. Okay, I don't see any new answers flowing in, so I think we can share the results. I'll try pushing the button myself. Let's see what happens. Do you see the results? Katerina, could you please tell me whether...
Yes, I can see the percentage results.
Okay, so what do we see? The first question was, which measurement approach yields the highest, most generous poverty thresholds? Some of you said survey-based modeling approach, others said the food-based statistical modeling approach based on the expenditure patterns. We'll see in a minute. Oh, we have very nicely divergent results also for the question of whether absolute or relative poverty should be or is expected to be higher in EU member states. What is the variability of absolute poverty like across EU member states? Is it greater or lower than the cross-country variability of AROP and ROP poverty rates? One answer is in favor of it being more variable. The other participants says it's equally variable. We'll see that in a minute as well. What were the poverty trends during the 2010s in the EU? Interesting responses, as all of you were claiming, both of you, I should say, were claiming that absolute poverty has been increasing. Let's see whether it is indeed the case. And then absolute poverty is expected to be at least as cyclical, based on your answers, as relative poverty over time. Let's go in turn over the next few minutes. So let's start with the poverty lines. Focusing on panel A, we see for 2020 the relevant poverty lines by the 3 approaches in the 3 pilot countries for single persons. We see that even though these poverty measurements are based on very different sources and very different identifying assumptions, we see that they are fairly comparable. We can also see that there's no clear ranking between these 3. The question was a bit tricky in that sense. There absolutely nothing guarantees, just by way of the method, that one or the other approach should yield higher or lower poverty threshold than another. And actually, if we look at these 3 pilot countries, we see that the ranking is different in each of them. We also see that food, housing, and to a lesser degree, residual expenditures represent the largest components of these poverty thresholds, and the contribution of transportation and health expenditures is very limited. So maybe if one tries to simplify this measurement framework in the future, one could include them as part of residual expenditures. We also see that the cross-country rankings are quite robust. This is, I'm already talking about the lower panel, where we compare the survey-based approach, poverty thresholds per month, with that of the food-based approach, which we have available for all EU countries except Austria, because Austria is not part of the EU HBS. You see that the poverty thresholds are fairly similar, and the country rankings are particularly robust to this choice. However, in a few cases, we see that the two approaches yield very different poverty thresholds. Now, it doesn't mean that one or the other measurement approach is worse. It only means that somehow in these countries, for whatever reason, maybe sampling reasons, maybe households' subjective valuation is the reason. For some reason, the poverty thresholds, as implied by the expenditure patterns based on the food-based approach, and the poverty thresholds, as indicated by households' subjective valuations, whether they are deficient or deprived in various expenditure categories, the relationship between these two is different. There's not a lot to do at this point. One could dig a bit deeper and try to identify why that can be the case. But with absolute poverty measurement, it's important to highlight that it's not necessarily the level that is important. Once we set a poverty threshold that is credible, the more important contribution of an absolute poverty threshold is to provide over time comparison and see how poverty changes over time. Let's move on to the poverty rates. Now, poverty rates, especially if you focus on the upper panel, you can see that they can considerably diverge even within countries for which different types of poverty, absolute poverty thresholds are available. Setting a different poverty thresholds translates into different poverty rates. The gaps sometimes are very large, but again, maybe the more important point is to fix a threshold and then see how poverty rates are changing over time. We can, however, claim that for those countries for which we have good reference points, existing national estimates, the absolute estimates are quite close to the ones that are around. If we look at the lower panel, we see that absolute poverty rates, as I think you rightly said, in poorer member states are higher than relative and arrow-based poverty rates, and the opposite, we can observe the opposite in richer EU member states. In these countries, of course, absolute poverty is lower, and there's a fairly high degree of high share of population that are deprived or poor in the relative sense, that have less than the prevailing standards, but they are not necessarily poor in the absolute terms. One can see also quite a large divergence between, say, EU 15 countries that you see in the left-hand side of the panel, and lower income CEE countries, newer EU member states, where absolute poverty can reach up to levels up to 50 and 60% in some countries. Now, poverty trends very quickly, and I'm about to finish. Of course, relative poverty, arrow poverty, is changing. Poverty thresholds are changing because of changes in income. If nominal incomes go up, then the relative poverty threshold also goes up. Absolute poverty rates, on the other hand, are driven by changes in prices. If the cost of living goes up, absolute poverty thresholds are regularly recalculated and become higher than before. So there's a completely different driving force between these two types of poverty measurement. And actually, if we focus on the last 10 years, we see quite different poverty trends in the lower panel. Arrow poverty has remained essentially fixed over the last 10 years. In relative terms, more or less the same share of the population is considered poor. Now, absolute poverty, on the other hand, is way more cyclical. And over the last 10 years, we've seen, especially if we start after 2010, so after the great financial crisis, when absolute poverty rates at the EU level hit 16–17%, we see a considerable decline up until 2018. I could now update these figures until 2020. We still couldn't see the effect of COVID and the current inflation pressure, but we can reasonably expect that this decline have been reversed or is being reversed in the current years to some extent. But the main takeaway is that absolute poverty, just like AROPI poverty, where low work intensity and material deprivation is picking up some of the cyclical effect, is more cyclical than relative poverty. And one has to bear that in mind if one fixes long-term policy targets. Now, very, very briefly, for a few minutes, and then I'll finish. We did a lot of contextualization in this report. We compared absolute poverty estimates with material and social deprivation across countries and within countries, with indicators of subjective poverty, what individuals feel the poverty thresholds to be and whether they feel poor or not. And also with respect to common EU-wide relative poverty thresholds. There's a quite nice alignment between these different approaches, which is reassuring to see and shows that it's not just a sort of technical exercise that we did, but very much a set of poverty thresholds that we came up with that are considered valid by the European population according to the surveys. We did a lot of validation, robustness, and sensitivity analysis. You can see that in the report. An entire 50-page chapter is devoted to assessing how the resulting poverty thresholds and poverty rates change if we tweak one or more various aspects of the modeling procedure. These are important choices. The result is that qualitatively, the absolute poverty picture remains the same, but of course, changing these components changes the poverty thresholds. And we considered how one could consider the needs of EU-wide scale-up and future monitoring, not least by offering simplified or more simplistic solutions that can be palatable to policymakers. My last slide is that there's a lot one can do and one should do in terms of data to improve the harmonization of European household surveys, to work towards integrated European household surveys where these different information components are available at the micro level in a combined manner, to increase the spatial disaggregation of survey data, have information at highly disaggregated regional level, and to extend data collection to previously lesser covered dimensions, focusing on hard to reach or underrepresented population groups that are typically not in these surveys, or to ask households about their preferences, minimum needs, and basic needs. Now I see a question: is some measure of variability available for the poverty rates with the APSPO approach? I'm not sure I get the hang of this question, but sure, the answer is definitely yes. So absolute, we have calculated around 1,000 different absolute poverty thresholds within a country based on different regional household level observable features. So different types of households based on their composition, based on their settlement type, based on their region of residence, they face different absolute poverty thresholds. And that is how one derives the poverty rates. Now, a measure of variability for poverty rates, I'm not sure that the question refers to cross-country variability or variability across different methods for a given country. But of course, these can be calculated without issue.
Yes,
and with this, I stop. Yes, my time is up.
No, I think that about the question, because it's also, I think, related on your point on spatial disaggregation. I think it's referring on how reliable are. But I think that until, if you have at the national level, you have no problems. You have national level data. So the idea is that if you go inside is, that's also a question that I have. So NUTS2 level should be feasible according to you, because the idea is that you have few data. When you go to NUTS2, maybe is not so reliable. So you see, because the survey is a national level survey, if you're using a survey. So I think that the question was referring to variability of the indicator itself. If you did the national level, I think you didn't focus on that, maybe. Yeah, variance of the indicator.
I'm still not sure that I understand. Of course, the question is, the issue is not that there's not enough data at the subnational level. Mm-hmm. These surveys are made of samples of several thousands. Yeah. So the problem is that the variable that sort of stands for region of residence and allows for regional disaggregation is defined at NUTS1 level. Very often that's the case with price statistics.
Yeah.
So you would probably want to go beyond, especially in some countries not, because in some countries NUTS1 level needs and living costs do not change that much. But in other countries, there's a substantial degree of heterogeneity in living costs and prices also within NUTS1 regions, and one should and could be able to exploit that. I know that for Italy, for example, Monica Pratesi is working with highly spatially disaggregated data and finds that poverty rates and poverty thresholds provide or offer very different pictures if one takes a more spatially disaggregated.
Yeah, we have this north-south divide, of course.
Yes, of course, some of that you also see with NUTS1, but the point is more that within NUTS regions, there are sort of various urban and rural areas and so regional pockets which are characterized by very different prices.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so we are running out of time, but
yes,
the last question that I wanted to ask you, because this project was, I think, very, very important, very interesting, very complex. But so that's about, my question is about, I mean, because, you know, in Italy, we already have these different measure of poverty, because as you said, in Italy, we already have this measure of absolute poverty. Then we have relative poverty, both based on expenditure, and then also the European measure based on the SILC, the income. Yes. So the question is that if this project continues and you're going to have more measures of poverty also at the European level, I think that this will complicate how we communicate this. So that's your feeling, that is, I mean, how then to make people understand that we have different poverty measures in this case. Have you thought about that? How then to use and communicate these differences? Do you think it will be easy, or how to do this part, which I think would be also very important?
Well, I have my personal views, but of course I'm no expert on that part. I have the feeling that the Italian Statistical Office and the Italian authorities have found a way to simultaneously keep or feature these measures as headline indicators of poverty, and I have the feeling that it doesn't you know, that it isn't very confusing for probably either the stakeholders or the broader public to understand what is going on. My personal opinion is that one could possibly find a way to have different metrics and communicate these in a clear and intelligible way to the broader public. But of course, this was a pilot project carried out by the JRC, and whether at some point this project will be taken up, and whether the policy making DGs in the first place will promote it to the point of it becoming suitable for social monitoring purposes. That's a question that I cannot answer.
Yeah, sure.
I know it's a very complex, long and mediated procedure. As you know, and potentially many of the attendees know, social policy is a domain where member state action and measures and policies take preference. So the Commission has very limited means in taking initiatives in that regard. My personal view is that the current inflation situation, which eats into households' real income, and a situation in which changes in living costs are becoming crucial determinants of the social situation, that this situation is a favorable one for promoting such a tool.
Yeah.
I know that it's a way more complex undertaking than calculating Arab-style relative measures. One has to be cognizant of that. But of course, we also know that beyond Italy, other countries are using absolute poverty thresholds, not least the US and Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the metrics that they use are more simplistic than what I have presented. But in this report, we also spend a great amount of attention on how one could simplify existing measures. And maybe I believe personally that the food budgets that we have constructed are very transparent and very clean. And using these Orshansky type kind of scalars, one could arrive at a set of poverty thresholds which are acceptable or could be acceptable to a large number of stakeholders. And then it's really about measuring progress rather than the level of the poverty threshold, in my view, that should count, and that could provide an important additional insights for policymakers and stakeholders and the broader European public to see where we stand on eradicating poverty in the EU, which is and has become a very important social policy objective.
Yeah, I agree. So thank you. I think we have to close. Time went on very, very fast. So thank you. Thank you really, Bálint, for this very interesting presentation. Many thanks also to our participants who joined us today. As a participant, you are invited to fill in a short survey about today's webinar. The survey will open in your browser just after the end of this Zoom meeting. If you don't have time right now, you will receive a link by email to fill in the survey later. We'd really appreciate your feedback to further improve the IMOS webinars. So the next webinar is scheduled on April the 19th, when Professor Roger Bivan from the Norwegian School of Economics will be presenting on the use of R for spatial econometrics. So for these and future webinars, please keep an eye out for our website, imos-events.com. So thank you again, Bálint, and have a nice evening to all the participants. Bye.
Thank you very much, Katerina.
Bye.